Welcome to Recross the Paths. My name is Cade. My guest today is Steven. Welcome, Steven. I'm glad you're here.
Thanks for having me.
The internet may also know Steven as Zoydraft. I'm so thrilled to get to take some time to chat today about pink sleeves, I guess both the cube and the blog. I suppose a fair jumping off question would be kind of in a chicken and egg way. Which came first for you?
The cube came first, and I guess technically just buying pink sleeves for my retail drafts was what came very first. I just love pink, and I liked keeping with that as kind of a thorny, don't engage with me if you don't think that pink sleeves is a perfectly good name kind of attitude.
So here we go from the sleeves for the draft to sleeves for the cube, and then to this blog that ties it all together. So this blog is pretty extensive, and I'm excited to unpack some of that. Like some of the things you've written in there have made their way certainly around the internet a bit. One particular thing you put together, a little article called Cube Design in the Zeitgeist, was picked up by Sam of Ristic Studies.
Yeah, so that was an article that I did about another cube that I worked on, Forbidden Trash, and really just reflecting on my process, but especially how my process was kind of in tandem with the cube community, where I felt like some of my ideas were coming up at the same time that I was hearing very similar ideas on podcasts and streams and that kind of thing. And I thought it was really special that I think I would have got to some of those ideas on my own, but they were coming up at the same pace that they were in the community, and the way that it was really fostered along by that, even though I wasn't necessarily getting the ideas directly from those places. And so I wrote that, and I got some really nice feedback on it at the time. And then a few months later, I was sitting working from home, which I don't normally do, and I saw Ristic Studies Substack come through, and I was like, oh, I'm going to look through that. And he goes on to talk about how he hasn't seen anything particularly worthwhile this year, except for two things. And one of them is this article that I had written. And I had no idea. Like, I knew that he followed Pink Sleeves on Cube Cobra, but he had never reached out to me, never spoken to us. I was like, oh my goodness.
That's awesome.
I went and read the blurb to my wife, and was just completely overwhelmed and didn't get any work done for the next 2 hours.
There's something really remarkable, right, about sending your work out into the void in a way, and then seeing that it's actually resonating for people, especially somebody like Sam.
Yeah, for sure. Like someone I totally look up to, and had been, I was subscribed to his Substack, so.
The truest show of love, really.
Yeah.
Well, Steven, you said you came from a limited background early on. How did you find your way into Cube, and why Cube now?
I got really directly into Cube. I only learned how to play Magic when I was 29. Probably a bad idea, but did it. And then less than a year into playing. So first of all, immediately I knew that draft was what I wanted to do. I just find drafting as a concept such a good mechanic. I'm a big fantasy hockey fan, and drafting is a great way to solve certain kinds of problems. So that appealed to me immediately. And so I was doing retail draft, and I was listening to Limited Resources, and they brought up Cube, and they were totally just talking about the vintage cube and Luis's Power Max cube. And I was like, oh wait, this is a way that I can just draft over and over again with my friends without having to buy new packs. Perfect. And so that was really my on-ramp, was like, okay, I'm putting together all the cards that I have from the last 9 months. I think I had every single blue creature that I owned was in the first draft of the cube. So I was like, okay, now we can just play, and we don't have to buy a box.
The perfect start. All of my favorite blue creatures in a box.
Yeah. And then I just kept with it. That wasn't too long before COVID. And then during COVID, it was just a good hyperfixation to stick with. I think my interests have broadened a little from Cube as the main focus to more game design more broadly, but I'm still super, super excited to play Cube whenever I get the chance.
And just for my curiosity, does that connect to how you engaged with something like fantasy hockey too? Because I know a lot of those are kind of numbers games.
I guess so. I think I'm actually despite the fantasy hockey stuff and industrial engineering is my educational background, I don't really engage with Magic in a very numbersy way. I'm way more interested in the play experience, and I think that the numbers could be a helpful way to get there, but I don't find myself using those same skills. However, I did used to write about fantasy hockey, and now I'm writing about cube design, and use the skills when you have them, but not always a one-to-one.
No, that's interesting, and certainly that sensibility comes through in your writing. That not a lot of what I've read of yours is about here's how the numbers break down. It is so much about player experience. Before we dive too deeply into the blog itself, just so we have a frame of reference, can you give us the elevator pitch for Pink Sleeves, the cube?
Yeah, so I mean, it's really just Magic the way I want to play it. It's one of those kind of cubes that doesn't have a good CubeCon elevator pitch, but really looking at if I don't get other opportunities to play Magic, how do I have a complete experience? And if my friends don't play other Magic, how do I give them a good experience? Which leads to both how do I pack in as much as I can, but also how do I make sure that people are able to come and enjoy it without having a lot of knowledge? And how do I make sure that they have a good experience?
That's such a great summary thought of engaging with both completeness and accessibility. And I think you reference it that way in your overview too.
Yeah, I have that as my guiding principles.
So how does that bear out here? Because I know, as you said, elevator pitch tough to kind of capture what the cube is going to look and feel like. But like, what elements of card inclusion are players going to notice that are going to point to something like that?
So I think there's a lot of it is like low card text, not a lot of keywords that you wouldn't need to know to play Magic. Like, yeah, you need to know what kicker is, but keeping that kind of thing simple, removing the hidden information, double face cards, what Parker would call trivia checks, trying to avoid that kind of thing, but still having a big broad set of effects. Like, I don't think people would think of Balance or Living Death as the simplest cards or the most beginner friendly cards. But I think those are really interesting cards. And they are cards that, even if you aren't a strong player, you can still understand what the idea is there, and it kind of sparks your imagination. It's not like a A-B combo piece where you really need to know something else in order to get it.
Well, and those are the sorts of cards, like you said, that you kind of grasp pretty quickly too. You see balance resolved one time, and then all of a sudden, oh, I get it now.
Yeah,
Whether you enjoy it or not, may be a different question.
definitely. And I've tried making like a much simpler cube, and you do run into the point where it's just like, oh, that wasn't very fun to play.
Mm.
Like, I can glance at the cards and understand how they all work, but it wasn't very engaging. I think Mark Rosewater has talked about how, as much as complexity is a cost, it's also a hook.
Yeah. You know, I think that speaks to that first question you were asking in your vision. Like, what if this is the only way that you get to play Magic? Like, if it's too simple an experience, you don't have all the depth to play around with.
Yeah, and another side of it that I look at is the cube is kind of a library of agency, to borrow a term from C.T. Nguyen. Each spell is something you can do, and you would not be able to do it. It would be impossible if that spell wasn't there. And so how do you get that space nice and broad? Which I think is something that's so wonderful about Singleton some of the time. If you have that in mind, Singleton is a great tool to broaden the possible things that can happen within a game.
Oh, that's interesting. So thinking of Singleton as more of a variety of opportunities rather than like just trying to engage with redundancy differently.
Yeah, definitely.
I appreciate that you've outlined a number of principles that you're aiming for here. You know, kind of like you mentioned, some of it's about reducing complexity, some of it's about making things clear to players. Like certain things that stick out to me are things where you noted that interaction always requires mana, like that you're not going to get just aced by something you don't see on board. How did you come to that level of specificity, or did these come like after putting things into the cube?
A lot of them came after, and I wouldn't consider any of them like unbreakable rules, but I have to have a really good reason to break them. But like that specific example, I had Fire Blast in the cube, and I won with it a couple times, and every time I just felt so bad that
Mm.
it was like the life draining away from my friends' faces. It's not just
Both literally and figuratively, right?
yeah, like they thought they had one more turn, and suddenly it's just done. And I don't know, like that's an important part to remember. Like it's not an opponent across the table from you. It's one of your friends, and I want my friends to have a great experience. And when I have that free interaction and they're not expecting it, that sucks.
Stephen, that's such a great thought to work with. That this isn't like an enemy to be beaten. This is somebody you hope does come back to your house eventually.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you speak some to power outliers? I love how you talk about this here.
Yeah, so my thing is that power outliers are fine until they prove that they're not fun. Power outliers also give you a really good piece of accessibility. There's a general rule that if people have more than 8 options to pick between, it severely reduces their decision making capabilities. And how that generally works in Magic is that if you're doing a draft, you're not actually considering all 15 cards. You have a short list of what you're interested in.
Right.
And when you have power outliers in the draft, that makes that short list way easier for you to make. And then you make better decisions. And then on the other hand, like, yeah, maybe Galta is winning a lot of games for me, but people are having a fun time with it.
At least one
Like,
player is having a very fun time with it.
yeah, it's a story. And on the other hand, there's cards that are not as good that people have a bad time with. Like, that's the real problem. Please get
Yeah.
that out of there right now.
Because like if you're not winning with it and you're not having a good time playing with it, that doesn't need to be there.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong. This cube also has the is the Hall of Salt kind of for that purpose.
Yeah, exactly. So some cards like Gideon Blackblade, Mimic Vat, and Miss Syndicate Naga are there because even though I didn't think they were too good, people were so unhappy losing to them. And then conversely, I have Yorion and Thousand Year Storm, where people were playing with them, and they felt like this should be doing more for me, and
Mm,
it never does. And I think both of those you could very easily blame the drafters, but why would you go to that trouble? Just
yeah.
just take them out, find something else that's more fun.
Somehow I enjoy this as being on display too. That when people are like, hey, why isn't X or Y in the cube? You can point and go, look, people already told us what we thought.
Yeah, people seem to get a kick out of that. So highly recommend it. You're making your own list.
So this is certainly an ongoing cube that you continue to add to. How do you look for new cards that meet your goals as you're trying to build into it?
I've really slowed down on new additions, but I do still look through card files and that kind of thing. The big thing is like, can I look at a card and be inspired by it? Like, is there something like, ooh, I could try this. This will play well with these other cards. Does it have that kind of a hook? I'm not the most adventurous tester anymore. When I was getting a lot more reps in with the cube, pre having kids, I would just put stuff in and try it out or do a digital draft or whatever. But now it's really like, is this a card that I can look at and understand what it does? And it gets me excited about how it's going to work with something else. Is it, I don't know. It's a very aesthetic, like, does this feel good to me?
Tough to pin down in a way that you can put in an even box.
Yeah.
One other thing I wanted to make sure to highlight as to how you've at least presented this cube is that it seems like you have eras of how this cube has existed over history. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah. I have a few clean breaks and I actually have copies of the old lists on Cube Cobra. So like the initial list is that list where all of my blue creatures were in it. I have continued this cube all the way from the beginning of my cube design.
That's
And
awesome.
yeah, so it's neat to be able to see the different eras. Like the early on, it's very inspired by what other people were doing in budget cubes at the time. And then it got more of a personality to it, I guess. And then there was a point where I decided I've played a lot of games with adventures and ninjutsu because those were both big things that I invested in early. And I'm ready to put those aside. And so I cut all the adventures and all the ninjutsu, and I have the snapshot of just before that. And then last summer, I guess it was now, I did a big overhaul. I had been working on the beginnings of a project with another player who I ended up just not having enough time to keep going with that project with him. But we were talking a lot about like how do we make more. The term he used was Stone Age magic,
Hmm.
um, and I thought that was a cool idea and just really focusing more. I think to him that meant more old school like 90s magic. To me, I took that as like, oh, what is like the fundamental magic spells that you would have as like a wizard or whatever? How do I get the most, not necessarily the very most simple version of them, but these really more atomic effects where this card does this to another card or moves a card from this place to another zone and really like on a fundamental level, like a spell does one thing, and what are you going to come up with to do with that?
Oh, that's interesting. I like that phrase, atomic effects, and I guess that's speaking toward like the potential to, I don't know, catalyze other outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And, like, it's all about combining things and creativity, not just I play this card and it provides me this much value.
That's cool. So, Stephen, these ideas about things like connectivity and how cards are used, these are the sorts of things that you explore in your blog of the same name, also Pink Sleeves. How did the blog come about as it pertains to your cube?
It's mostly a kind of journaling. I'm always very interested in writing down my thoughts and putting them out there. I'm not a big self promoter of them for the most part, but back to when I was a teenager, I would write about every punk show that I went to, wrote about hockey analytics when I was doing that more. It was just really natural to be like, okay, we did a draft. What are all my thoughts on it? How do I organize those? How do I make sure that I'm actually reflecting on it and bringing it forward? So probably 80% of the blog is just for myself, but I'm happy to have people look in if they want to. And then a smaller proportion is stuff where I'm trying to put together more of like an essay to share with people.
That seems like a really mature way to engage with that sort of thing. Or is that like it can be easy to finish up something like a draft and go, well, good time or bad time maybe, and then just bounce on to the next one. Or like jump straight to numerical analytics, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think it helps that I like writing, so it's a pleasurable experience for me to take that time and do that. I'm not a person who it's pulling teeth for, so it's not like it takes self discipline.
Well, part of that, I know you include some deck photos and some write ups. Do you think of those as kind of just history markers for yourself, or are those things you hope your players will look back at?
I know that the players do look back at it, but it is more the main thing is for myself, especially noticing like what were cards that worked cool together and what were things that people were excited about. Because that's really at the end of the day, I'm really, really trying to give everyone the best experience they can. And so if people got excited about this or people got tripped up by this other card, that's the kind of thing I really want to capture and take as data points going forward when I'm thinking about changes to the cube.
Yeah, and that's something that I really appreciated about what you're doing here is that the way you have it written down, it is kind of like a story or like a news report that you're able to say, here's how this person felt or how they expressed that they felt based on the cards that they had. Like it's really a very personal write up.
Yeah, I mean, it's really the attitude of these are my friends around the table and I care about them and want to have a great time. The cube isn't something more than that. The cube is an enabler for that.
Well, in addition to being kind of a journal of sorts, I know you also take the time to sketch out different types of design thoughts. I know there was one article I enjoyed of yours that I think it's called "Looking at a Pack of Magic Cards and Thinking About the Texture of Different Cubes," and it was just kind of a list of different questions to ask.
Yeah, that was inspired a little bit by Matt Grenier, who had talked about, I don't know if it was exactly that you don't look at the whole list of a cube, but really drilling down on just take a random pack and analyze it really, really, really thoroughly. And I love that idea. He was mostly talking about the themes of a cube, but in this case, as you mentioned, it's more like what are all the different ways that a cube could be? Like almost sketching out what you would consider in a taxonomy. But yeah, like thinking about like what's the role of shuffling here? Are lands more based on coming in tapped or costing life? What's the economy of burn spells or counter spells or whatever else? And so just going through a pack of cards and thinking thinking really hard about magic cards and writing down everything that could differentiate one cube from another to kind of try to make explicit those questions that designers could ask themselves about what kind of environment they're building.
And this is kind of in that lane of like a single pack should tell a complete story, right?
Yeah, totally. That's another thing Mark Rosewater talks about. Like, if you can't see it in a pack, is it really there?
When you're writing down ideas like this, is your hope that other people will adopt them, or is it something more like to process for yourself?
I think of a lot of it's for myself, but I do hope that it's helpful for other people. I think that very, very little of what I write should be taken prescriptively. I tend to think more in terms of tactics. Like, this is something you could do to make your cube better if it's appropriate. I'm not thinking like everyone should do this. but more equipping people with stuff they can try if it resonates with them.
One of the other things I appreciated that you post on here as well are unfinished work. Like there's one that's labeled where flavor and agency collide, a deck tech illustration, and I think you even introduce it as, "Hey, this is just part of an idea that I wanted to save."
Yeah, so that was a piece where I was in the middle of reading Playing Oppression, and so was very tuned into like what is being enacted in this game. And I drafted this white and black deck where the flavor of the cards was very much like the community building each other up and the strength in numbers kind of thing. But as you're playing the game, you're like, oh, I'm telling you to sacrifice yourself for the good of the community, which actually just means me winning the game. And
Hmm.
when you think about that more closely, it's pretty gross. So I was writing about that and I sent it to a few people whose opinions I trust. And they were kind of like, oh, yeah, that's interesting, but I don't know if we really need to worry about that as cube designers. And it was like, yeah, I think this idea has run as far as I need to run with it right now, but I'm still going to put it here for myself.
I think that's nice, like that not every idea has to be perfectly polished to go out into the ether.
Yeah, I mean, I think people get a lot better through repetition than through polishing. Like polishing is valuable, but doing things more often helps helps a lot. And if I kept working on that, I wouldn't have worked on other things.
Well, one of the big things that you've written about, and most recently, I think the article that really resonated for myself and for many others was titled "What Am I Asking Players to Pay Attention to?" As so many designers are leaning towards, or at least thinking about things like accessibility and elegance, this is a big topic to explore.
Yeah, so I was reading the book Unboxed Board Game Experience and Design by Gordon Calleja, and just his second chapter, I think it was about attention as the core concept in game design. And he tells like I thought, a really evocative story of he was designing a game and he really wanted it to have almost puzzly decision making, but also a really strong story. And he made it, and people responded well to it. They enjoyed that decision making that he was going for. And it wasn't even too complicated for people. People were able to handle it, but they were paying enough attention to those puzzles that they didn't experience the story. And it completely failed as a narrative game, in his opinion. And I'll take him at his word on that. Um, but I thought that was such a powerful thought technology of thinking about what you want players to pay attention to and what your game asks players to pay attention to and how those might not be aligned. I'm a big believer that accessibility is in itself a good that is going to be beneficial for the majority of people, even whether or not they're the target beneficiary of it. But when you switch it to attention instead of accessibility or complexity or whatever else, it becomes completely agnostic of any specific set of goals, and you can apply it to what you want the game to be about. Like if you want the game to be really, really difficult to track, you want it to be really, really deep decision making, then maybe you should take out things that draw your attention away from those things. Like the very most basic example is if you wanted to have the spikiest cube possible, you probably shouldn't use bizarre secret layers as the art. Like
Hmm.
let people focus on those strategic decisions instead of parsing which card this is, or even just being distracted by, oh, that's really nice art. And so just encouraging designers to think like anything that is drawing attention away from where you want the focal point to be, is that really aligned with your goals? And maybe that's something you should consider trimming.
Do you think that there are like universal elements that players or designers should be paying attention to in that process?
I think people should probably be paying attention to accessibility and making sure that people are able to come in and enjoy your cube and have a rich, engaging experience that isn't just completely overwhelming. But the idea of attention, I like that you don't have to agree with me on those things. You can just say, you know what, I don't mind if it's really, really complicated, as long as I can get people to focus on this part of it.
Well, I appreciate the reference to art in particular, or like the printing and how that can, if that's something you have to devote a measure of brain space to, you're not able to devote the same kind of attention and focus to to the gameplay or to how cards interact with one another.
Yeah, and the same thing goes for shuffling, or if I'm taking time flipping a double faced card, that's time that I'm not
Hmm.
spending on more engaging parts of the play.
Sensei's divining top, for example.
Yeah. And maybe I want everyone to focus on Sensei's divining top, and that's great. But if I don't want them to, then it's probably a bad choice.
Yeah, I think that sounds like such a helpful lens too, where you can say, well, if you want a more quote unquote complex environment, that you're able to shift where people are able to focus by cutting out other things that are less important to that end.
Yeah, and it's something also that WotC uses a lot. Like one of their rules is they really don't want instant speed interaction in the graveyard because they don't want you to have to pay attention to the graveyard or your opponent's graveyard.
Right.
And so just thinking about in terms of like individual card designs, where is this drawing my attention and is that really what I want to do?
The term accessibility is good because we folks often think that way. That can often be mischaracterized. Can you speak to some of how that can happen?
Yeah, I think that a lot of the time people hear accessibility and they think, well, I don't need to do that because my play group knows the cards and they know how to read the cards. They're not going to get overwhelmed. But those kinds of decisions, like how big are your board states going to be? How much are you shuffling? Affect the experience of every player. And it's not that you always have to make everything as simple as possible. That's not what I do, but these are real human limitations. And if you're pulling a player's attention in too many directions, that's going to be tough for anyone. It's going to affect their experience. And maybe someone really, really likes the experience of being completely overwhelmed. Um, but it's, but in general, like if you pull your player's attention in too many directions, the primary experience is going to be being overwhelmed, not paying attention to all those different things.
Do you think there's a particular relationship between something like simplicity and accessibility? I know some people like to use those terms interchangeably.
There's definitely a correlation, but there are ways that you can make something accessible without keeping it simple. Like going back to Balance and Living Death as examples of cards that I really like. Those aren't the simplest cards. You get it after a rep or two, but they're also not that complex because they're both sorceries. Like you're casting them on your turn and it happens and then it's over. You're not making the game more complicated going forward. That's another thing that I've written about this difference between is this card complex versus what the experience of playing with those cards is. Whereas like Tarmogoyf, that's a pretty simple card, but it requires constant ongoing attention. And so that's the kind of places where I can see accessibility and simplicity uncoupling.
Are there things you wanted to include or have wanted to include in the Pink Sleeves Cube that you've chosen not to because of these principles?
I'm sure that there's been many cards over the years. Actually, there's a few cards where they reference specific card types, like battles or whatever. Like this would be a really good card for this cube, but I don't want to do that. I've also decided not to have sagas in the cube, which I love sagas, but it just felt like one more thing that I didn't feel quite strongly enough about. And then an example of a card that's in the cube right now that I probably shouldn't have in the cube is Damn, because it's a great black or white card, and it just looks like a black card if you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, I know that one has been kind of polarizing for people for that reason. It's like it fills the role of a Wrath of God, it fills the role of kind of a modern Doomblade, but unless you know that it's both of those, it's functionally a split card, that it's easy to not think of it that way.
Yeah, I think I would like to proxy it as a split card, but I haven't done that yet.
And it sounds like in that same spirit of making things accessible, the more you do Sharpie errata or custom versions of cards, the more it's, and correct me here if I'm wrong, it sounds like that would kind of lose some of what you're aiming for in this project.
Yeah, so there's a general principle in any design accessibility of not defying people's expectations unless you're doing it on purpose. And I think that Sharpie errata is pretty bad for that. I've done Sharpied lands, so they just come in untapped, but I think that's about the limit of where I would go with that.
And that's not to say the players shouldn't pursue that if that fits their goals, but I was just thinking in terms of how you've used this one.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, certainly the blog is full of all sorts of really great thoughts and reference to how you've engaged with Cube over time. If you were to try to summarize some of that, what's some advice that you would give to players in their own step of the journey? Or I should say to designers. I think I said players.
I think being reflective and paying attention to how players experience the cube is so central, regardless of any other goals that you may have. You can make a cube that looks beautiful on Cube Cobra and would be perfect for a pot of 8. But if you actually only ever play with 4 people, then the way that they experience it is the real cube. That's like a little thing that drives me crazy is people are like, oh, well, I want to know what it's really like. Like if we had a pot of 8, it's like, no, when you played with your friends, that was really the cube.
Mm.
That's it. And so just reflecting on what is it like for people to play and what do they take away from it and what are the good moments that are created and focusing on the gameplay rather than some abstract idea of what the cube is.
In a way, it feels like we're talking about art all of a sudden.
Oh no.
Well, no, I mean, like, what is the actual experience? Is it the cube and the spreadsheet? Is it the box of cards together? Or is it what players actually, what actually happens at the end?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very firmly on the it's on what actually happens at the end side of that.
Well, Stephen, I want to make sure that I get to ask you one of my favorite questions here as we turn toward wrapping up, which is if you could have any card printed as a promo, what card would it be and who would you have do the illustration?
So my pick is Zim Mesmeric Lord, which is one of the playtest cards. So
Yeah. Sweet.
it's 1 a blue and 2 black for a legendary vampire wizard, 3/4 with flying and death touch. And when Zim enters the battlefield, target opponent chooses an order for the cards in their hand, then reveals them one by one until you say stop. That player then discards the most recently revealed card, which can be like a little bit difficult to wrap your head around. But it's not a fact or fiction, but it's a mini game like fact or fiction combined with discard. So I love it. It's like such a fun way to, engage with both players and do hand disruption, which I think is like a really interesting part of Magic. For my artist, I would like to go with a local Toronto comic artist, Eric Kostiak Williams, who does a lot of queer nightlife art. And he's very good at likenesses and, accurate anatomy and that kind of thing, but also very psychedelic and weird. And so I think he could really do an amazing job of doing this mesmeric vampire wizard who is doing some kind of thought seizing effect. I think he could knock it out of the park.
Eric's work is incredibly trippy. I'm getting to experience this fresh here, and yeah, it definitely seems like the kind of thing, especially when you're talking about like the hand disruption, kind of the brain bendy side of a card like this. That I think that would fit well on. It's a cool choice.
Yeah, I hope he does it.
I'll get my people on it.
Perfect.
Well, Stephen, this has been a pleasure for me, and I'm so glad that we got a chance to connect here and talk some about this. And I'm so appreciative of you taking the time to detail your thoughts, not just for yourself, but in a way that folks like me get to appreciate and enjoy them and learn from them.
Yeah, I mean, it's so amazing connecting with anyone and hearing that these dumb thoughts that I had for myself are helping them out and they're finding them interesting.
Well, certainly not dumb thoughts. There's a lot to enjoy and a lot to grow from. Certainly if folks want to learn more, they ought to go visit this blog. But also, if folks want to connect with you, what would be the best place to point them to?
The blog is zoydraft.tumblr.com. I'm also on Blue Sky and on MTG Cube Talk. If you want to message me on either of those spots, that's great. I also want to shout out Untapped TO, which is Toronto's first mid-sized cube event coming up in September 14th.
Yes.
Pink Sleeves is going to be there. I am not an organizer. I'm just a cheerleader. But I hope that some people for whom getting to Toronto is reasonable will be there, and I'll see you there.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Stephen, so much again for your time and just for sharing this moment. I'm excited for more opportunities to connect in the future.
Yeah, thanks so much.